The EU wants to improve its finances by introducing a CO2 tax on imports, but in doing so, she risks that the instrument will become unreliable in terms of climate policy in the eye of trading partners. If the heads of state and government of the European Union have their way, there will be a CO2 border tax on imports into the Union from 2023. Such a change would be based on the CO2 value that arises in the production of the imported goods. At the recent summit, they decided to use it to supplement the EU budget. An instrument that is actually intended for climate policy is thus given a fiscal policy thrust. Commission President Dr. Ursula von der Leyen had already announced in 2019 that she would like to introduce a carbon border tax as part of her European Green Deal. In the spring of 2020, the Commission started a roadmap process with the aim of drafting specific bills by 2021. With this proposal, the Commission also reacted to the fear that the comparatively higher European CO2 costs caused by the EU emission trading scheme could induce companies to migrate, leading to carbon leakage. The European goal of reducing emissions is effective in the EU, but not globally. So far, the Union has countered the risk of emigration by allocating emission allowances to endangered sectors free of charge. A CO2 border tax would be an alternative that would also have a global impact. After many years of resistance from many states and business associations against the instrument, it had received increasing support more recently. The EU climate target for 2030, which is to be increased in the autumn and will lead to further CO2 costs for the EU economy, will contribute to this. In addition, many see the CO2 levy on foreign products, not only because of the expected effectiveness against carbon leakage, as a clear sign of implementation of the Paris Agreement, above all towards the USA and China. When designing the instrument, it is now important to comply with WTO rules and to induce important trading partners to cooperate. The Commission proposes 3 ways in which a CO2 border adjustment system could be implemented: with a CO2 tax, a customs duty, or with a certificate requirement for foreign companies. From a commercial law perspective, all options could be designed in accordance with WTO rules. These dictate the principle of non-discrimination, which is why a border tax must neither distinguish between similar products nor between WTO member states. Should it be necessary to violate this, for example because EU trading partners or individual companies can be shown to reduce emissions themselves, the requirements for exceptional cases would have to be complied with. An EU-wide CO2 product tax or its introduction by the EU member states would be the best way from a commercial law perspective. To do this, the EU would first have to levy a CO2 tax on goods manufactured in the European Union. Then it would be unproblematic to apply this tax to imports as well. VAT is a comparable example. Imported goods of the same kind would then be treated in the same way as domestically produced products in accordance with the WTO. Applying emissions trading to industrial imports would be more complex. The task of the Commission would be to show that the CO2 certificate price is ultimately equivalent to a product tax under commercial law. If this does not succeed, the Commission could argue that it aims to protect a global resource, that is, the prevention of carbon leakage is the central goal of EU legislation. Because the protection of a global resource, which includes the Earth's atmosphere, is permitted as a reason for violating WTO principles, but subject to conditions. Such an exception would also be needed for a new CO2 tariff. With the intention of introducing the CO2 border tax as a budgetary instrument, the heads of state and government have now increased the risk that WTO arbitration tribunals, in the event of a challenge by trading partners, will not regard the new instrument as a climate policy instrument, but as a means of generating income. The purpose of climate policy, which would be taken into account in decisions on exceptions to the WTO principles, is receding into the background. A CO2 border adjustment system, which already needs a great deal of explanation due to the many open details, can only promote international cooperation on climate policy if trading partners are informed at an early stage and regularly involved. The EU should use forums of the WTO and the climate regime as well as other international organizations for this purpose. In 2012, the European Commission painfully learned the upheavals that going it alone can lead to. At that time, they wanted to introduce the EU ETS for international air traffic as well. Many large states put the EU under massive pressure with threats of sanctions, whereupon the EU wrote back and finally only asked for certificates for air traffic in the European Economic Area. Trust can only arise if the EU adheres to multilateral climate and trade policy agreements. That means it supports the Paris Climate Agreement and the ailing WTO and repeatedly expresses this clearly. The task has probably become much more difficult after the summit resolution, because a border tax for fiscal reasons cannot be assigned convincingly to these multilateral concerns, especially since the income will not benefit the promotion of climate protection, for example in poorer countries, but the EU coffers. Should a CO2 levy specifically cover goods in the cement, steel or other energy-intensive industries, as has already been discussed, producers from emerging and industrialized countries would be particularly affected. The Union should start talks quickly with these states in particular. The G20 finance ministerial consultations in Saudi Arabia towards the end of the year offer a good opportunity to do this. In addition, in its dialogue with Washington, the EU should at least try not to allow its approach to appear as a new fuel in the simmering tariff dispute. Ultimately, the climate policy success of a CO2 border tax will depend on how these countries react to it. And if you now want to know more about European politics from a German point of view, YouTube has chosen another of my videos right here for you in the end screen, right next to your chance to subscribe to my channel. I'll see you in my next video. Click and enjoy. Viel Spaß!